Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is this week's lecture for English 1010. For today, I want to continue this conversation about compare and contrast essays. In last week's audio, I discussed the compare and contrast essay prompt, but perhaps more importantly, I talked about this outline that appears on D2L under the prompt, and broadly speaking, the two perhaps methods you might use or the two models you might use when writing your compare and contrast essay, the subject by subject or the point by point method. I spoke about the strengths and weaknesses of each. So as you're conceptualizing your essay, that's certainly something you should think about. Do you want to write an essay that feels and looks more like a subject by subject essay, or do you want to write an essay that looks and feels more like a point by point essay? And I'll certainly return to this when I talk about the Amy Chua essay, Why Chinese Mothers Are Superior, but I'll also spend a bit of time today talking about transitional phrases and how not just in any bit of writing or any piece of composition, but especially in compare and contrast essays, those kinds of transitional words and phrases are so important because they really help to just tether the essay together. And again, I'll come back to this in just a second, but my apologies, I am recording at home today, so if you hear my dogs, if you hear a bit of barking, that's why I don't have new office mates. It's just my dogs here at the house. But okay, let's talk about the Amy Chua essay, Why Chinese Mothers Are Superior. And as a way of starting, I want us to think about, and I've said this or something similar to this before talking about almost anything that I've asked you to read that I've also discussed on these lectures. What's perhaps the question, or what are the set of questions that the author in question wants to explore, and how do those questions inform what they write? And I think for someone like Chua, there's perhaps a couple of different questions that inform this essay. I think the first one and the obvious one, what are the similarities and differences between Eastern parenting practices and Western parenting practices, or Chinese parents and American parents, but specifically for Chua, Chinese mothers and American mothers. But in addition to just that kind of compare and contrast work, I think Chua also wants to perhaps better understand or better explore the sorts of values that inform these different parental approaches. And that's just another way of saying parenting, I suppose, is a lot like teaching. And as someone who's in a position to educate, the teacher must think about and consider, well, not just what do I want my students to learn, but how do I want them to learn this? And not only what a teacher wants their students to learn, but how they want them to learn that information or those principles. There are certain values attached to it. And I think for someone like Chua, again, there are certain values attached to Chinese or Eastern parenting practices and American and Western parenting practices. And I think if you want to understand the problem at large that she has with Western or American parents, I think it's precisely that question of values, right? What do Chinese mothers want their children to be? What sorts of values, what sorts of perhaps personality predilections do they want them to have? And by contrast, what sorts of, again, personality predilections do American and Western mothers and parents want their children to have? And I think that's really the crux, or that's this line in the sand, so to speak, between these two approaches to parenting for someone like Chua. But I think an interesting place to start, and this also gives us a sense of her tone, is just with this introduction, because this is something of a radical departure from many of the introductions that we've seen thus far in the reading I've asked you to do. And I'll just read directly from the essay. A lot of people wonder how Chinese parents raise such stereotypically successful kids. They wonder what these parents do to produce so many math whizzes and music prodigies, what it's like inside the family, and whether they could do it too. Well, I can tell them because I've done it. Here are some things my daughters, Sophia and Louisa, were never allowed to do. Attend a sleepover, have a play date, be in a school play, complain about not being in a school play, watch TV or play computer games, choose their own extracurricular activities, get any grade less than an A, not be the number one student in every subject except gym and drama, play any instrument other than the piano or violin, not play the piano or violin. So I'll come back to this bullet list, but I think right there in the opening sentence, we have a clear sense of, again, this question of values and what Chua as a parent seems to value, and it's that word successful. I think for someone like Chua, the sorts of values and the value at large that informs her parenting practices is one of success, not just for herself as the parent, but it seems what she's arguing is good parents produce successful children. Success seems to matter so much to her. And she returns to this idea multiple times throughout the essay. But remember that word success, because I think it's important. Now, regarding this bullet list, I think this list has a couple of different effects. I think the first, especially as a Western reader, it feels like she's almost indulging in a caricature of what her audience might think of her. This is something I've also spoken about throughout the semester, just having an awareness of who your audience might be and the sorts of expectations that your audience might bring to your writing. I think with Chua here, she has a very clear sense of what her audience thinks of her, or what she thinks her audience thinks of her. And notice how she uses that assumption to a kind of sarcastic comedic effect. I think you see it not just in the length of the list, but also in the way the list really builds upon itself. For example, be in a school play, but then the very next thing her children could not do, complain about not being in a school play. I think Chua is attempting to have a little fun here, but she's also here at the beginning engaging this stereotype that she perhaps thinks her audience has about her. And one of the questions, and I don't necessarily know if I have a good answer to this, but one of the questions I always think about when I read and teach this essay is Chua doing something productive by, for lack of a better phrase, leaning into this stereotype of the draconian, tyrannical Chinese mother? Because this is certainly something of a cultural stereotype. And I think there are ways for any one of us as readers to say she's actually doing more harm than good by reinforcing this stereotype, or perhaps you could argue because she's aware of it, she's actually exposing it and playing with it a bit and having some fun with it. But that's a question that I'll leave you to consider. Do we actually think Chua, by exploiting this stereotype, is doing more harm than good or good than harm? It's just something to think about. But as you read throughout the essay, I think what you might notice, if we wanted to think about the form this essay takes, especially in relation to compare and contrast essays, I think this is more often than not a point-by-point essay. But one of the things that I like about this essay is how Chua uses particular personal experiences as a way of reinforcing her larger points. And I think this essay is a great example of how to do that in your own writing. This is something I've encouraged many of you to do throughout the semester, using personal experiences as a way of supporting and developing your claims. And Chua is quite good at doing this. For example, go to the second page or page 2, and it's on the left side of the page, and it's the third full paragraph, the one that begins with the fact that Chinese parents can do things that would seem unimaginable, even legally actionable to Westerners. And I won't read this whole paragraph because I think there's a regrettable amount of body shaming happening in this paragraph, which might date this essay in a particular sort of way. But again, I think what Chua does here, especially by using dialogue, she's giving us perhaps a picture of a conversation that she's had or a conversation that she's overheard, something that she's experienced perhaps. But I think also here just how candid she is with how either she's spoken to her own children or how a Chinese mother may speak to their child about questions of health. I think this gives us, again, a clear sense of Chua deploying this stereotype in ways that might challenge her reader in some ways. And I think it's perhaps challenging a reader on a couple of different levels and in a couple of different ways. I think the most obvious way that it's challenging a reader, again, especially if her assumption is that her audience is a Western audience or a group of Western parents or readers who have had Western parents, it as Chua seems to think, it attempts to lay bare how, according to Chua, Western parents, quote, tiptoe around the issue or refuse to address a particular problem directly. And I'll talk about why Chua thinks this. It's connected to notions of self-esteem that she wants to develop later in the essay. But what this also does, again, it's perhaps challenging a reader to think about, again, these kinds of stereotypical roles that parents often take and assume, and how perhaps for someone like Chua, sometimes those roles and those stereotypes have distinct cultural and geographic underpinnings to them, which is to say, it's this way, and Chua does this explicitly in the essay itself. It's right there in the conceit that some parenting practices and some parenting trends are just inherent within particular communities, particular cultures, etc. But what she perhaps wants us to think about here at this particular moment is, again, this question of well, why is it that Chinese parents, according to Chua, are so much more candid with their children and would say things that Western parents would not? And according to Chua, it's because of self-esteem, because for a Western parent, the thing they are concerned about the most with their children is not, again, success, this thing I mentioned early in the essay, but it's about how their children feel. Feelings matter more than anything else. And again, as a Western audience, this might put us in a position where we're thinking, my goodness, Chua actually needs to do a lot here to persuade us that this is a valid point that we should accept, because what Chua, I think one potential idea that as readers we could extract from this is that she seems to think that success above anything else matters more, perhaps even more so than mental health. But Chua, and I'll talk about this later, she seems to argue that, well, if you are successful, then all of those other things will perhaps fix or correct themselves. And again, I think we could certainly challenge Chua on those grounds. But I want to spend a minute talking about this clear distinction she makes between Western parents and Eastern parents, or American parents and Chinese parents, and this focus on self-esteem and feelings, because I think this is something certainly worth spending a bit of time and thinking about. And this is still on page 2. And this is, if you check the right side of the page, it's that second full paragraph. I've noticed that Western parents are extremely anxious about their children's self-esteem. They worry about how their children feel if they fail at something, and they constantly try to reassure their children about how good they are, notwithstanding a mediocre performance on a test or at a recital. In other words, Western parents are concerned about their children's psyches. Chinese parents aren't. They assume strength, not fragility, and as a result, they behave very differently. And I think, again, if we wanted to think about, well, what sorts of values really inform, for someone like Chua, these different parenting approaches, I think you could probably add, in addition to success, a word like strength. Because notice what Chua says at the end of this paragraph. Chinese parents aren't. They assume strength, not fragility. So notice the argument she makes here, because she's in effect arguing that to parent like a Chinese parent is to parent under the assumption that your children are strong. But to parent as a Western parent is to assume that your children are fragile. And I would love to know what any or all of you think of this. Does this mirror or reflect your experiences, either as someone who had parents or as someone who parents? Because it's entirely possible that several of you are parents. I don't know, but I am curious to know if this actually matches or tracks with your experiences. Is Chua right here? Do Western parents care far too much about their children's feelings and this sense of self-esteem? Or is this an oversimplification that Chua makes in an attempt to support what she thinks and perhaps more importantly, how she believes parenting should work? Again, this assumption of strength and not weakness and fragility. But this is one way that Chua, in effect, supports this way of parenting. It's not that she's just tyrannical because she's sadistic or she enjoys inflicting pain. It's because she knows that her children are strong, and because she knows they're strong, she knows they can take it, for a lack of a better phrase. And she continues to develop this point near the bottom of the page, and this is the part of the essay where she, again, writes perhaps quite humorously about what would happen if a Chinese child came home with anything other than an A, and this is the final paragraph. Chinese parents demand perfect grades because they believe that their children can get them. If their child doesn't get them, the Chinese parent assumes it's because the child didn't work hard enough. That's why the solution to substandard performance is always to excoriate, punish, and shame the child. The Chinese parent believes that their children will be strong enough to take the shaming and to improve from it. And when Chinese kids do excel, there is plenty of ego-inflating parental praise lavished in the privacy of the home. So I think this is a really interesting paragraph for a couple of reasons, because again, it's perhaps expanding or broadening our understanding of the values that inform what Chua ultimately thinks good parenting looks like. And here we could add to words like success and strength, confidence. Because notice the first sentence of the paragraph. Chinese parents demand perfect grades because they believe that their children can get them. Chinese parents, according to Chua, are supremely confident, not in their abilities as parents, but in their children's abilities to succeed. If according to Chua, the child doesn't succeed, it's quite simply because the child didn't work hard enough. Now, I want to pause over this because I think this is perhaps one of the moments where we could certainly challenge Chua and say, well, aren't you placing far too much confidence in the ability of any one individual to do anything to really affect in a meaningful way the course and the trajectory of their life? And what I mean by that is this. I suspect a lot of you have friends, parents, family members, perhaps even yourself. And you would say, yes, I'm an extremely hard worker. My parents are extremely hard workers. my family members, my friends, so on and so forth, they work so hard, yet they just can't seem to get ahead. I suspect we've all had, and we've probably felt this way ourselves, we've all had people in our lives, even ourselves, and we feel that way, that there's no amount of hard work to change a system that is disproportionately created to reward some people and not reward others. I think we've all had these feelings before. So for someone like Chua just to say success is a matter of hard work seems to miss or ignore certain structures that are in place that prevent some people, a large number of people, despite how hard they work, from actually experiencing success. And that's maybe the question I would ask you to consider with a paragraph like this. Is Chua just ignoring the world around her and how the world around her and the world around her children could work in a way, or again, there are certain systems and structures in place that it doesn't matter how hard you work, you'll only really go so far. Because again, I think a lot of us have felt that way about ourselves, or we felt that way about our parents, family members, friends, etc. And it's also worth mentioning that Amy Chua is a professor and a lawyer at an Ivy League institution. She has extremely expensive and prestigious degrees. She is remarkably well-credentialed. And her children are certainly experiencing the benefits of that privilege in the same way that a child born into poverty regrettably experiences the horrors of poverty. A child in poverty inherits that poverty in the same way that a child of privilege inherits that privilege. So again, I think that's just a circuitous way to get to this larger question, which is, if we wanted to challenge Chua, could we say, well, you're really not taking the world as it exists into consideration, and it's really easy for someone in your position just to say, work hard and you'll succeed. And if you don't succeed, it's because you didn't work hard enough. But this is perhaps also a paragraph where, if we wanted to imagine that Chua's having a bit of fun, that again, she understands, I mentioned this earlier, she understands this stereotype, and she's almost miming or mimicking this stereotype as a way of just revealing it as a stereotype. I think this is maybe one of the paragraphs where you could see this, because notice she says, that's why the solution to substandard performance is always to excoriate, punish, and shame the child. I wonder, how seriously do you take her when she says something like that? Is she being serious? Does she write a line like this and do so winking at us as she does it? It's a question worth asking and considering, because I think if you come to the conclusion that this essay, well, yeah, sure, Chua basically believes this, or you conclude that Chua basically believes this, but she basically cloaks this belief of hers in a kind of satirical humor about how Westerners stereotype not just people from the East, but in particular the Chinese mother as a kind of cultural stereotype, then these sorts of moments start to make a little more sense. And you could even argue what you think her purpose for writing this might change a little bit. And I think here at this point, I just want to talk about the conclusion of the essay, because I think she, again, whether you agree or disagree with Chua, I think she is quite effective at communicating her ideas and in particular summarizing them in moments like this in the conclusion. Again, just notice how direct, clear, and concise she is. Quote, Western parents try to respect their children's individuality, encouraging them to pursue their true passions, supporting their choices, and providing positive reinforcement and a nurturing environment. By contrast, the Chinese believe that the best way to protect their children is by preparing them for the future, letting them see what they're capable of, and arming them with skills, work habits, and inner confidence that no one can ever take away. So again, when thinking about this question of values, we have a clear sense, if we were not, for example, paying attention to what these values are for a writer like Chua. For Western parents, too often, the values that really underpin their parenting practices are individuality, for example, encouraging their children to pursue their passions, really focusing on their children's emotions and feelings. But for a Chinese parent, it's about success. It is about confidence, and it's in particular about knowing or assuming that their children are strong. So confidence, success, strength. And I suppose, and I think I mentioned a question like this earlier, but I'll say it again. I would really encourage you to think about, well, because I think Chua wants you to think about this a little bit. She's inviting you to think about this. Which of these two approaches, as Chua describes it, would you have wanted for yourself? Would you, and I think to actually indulge in this exercise, you probably need to think for a minute and consider, well, would I have thrown my parents into this Western category or into this Eastern Chinese category, as Chua describes it? But which do you think would have benefited you more? Do you actually, after hearing Chua describe this, have you come to this realization that your parents just cared a little too much about your feelings and your self-esteem, and you feel like you would have actually been better benefited or benefited better from a parenting practice or style that feels more like Chua's? Or maybe just after reading this essay, it becomes clear to you that you think Chua is just reinforcing the wrong values, and that you think focusing on someone's self-esteem, that maybe success isn't the most important thing in the world, and there are more important things than success. Because, and we haven't really talked about this a lot, but I think so much implicitly of what Chua argues, so much of those good feelings, that sense of stability that her parenting practice attempts to cultivate, for someone like Chua, it seems like you only really get there through material success and prosperity. And you might come to the realization that, quite frankly, those sorts of things just don't matter that much. So it's an interesting essay. It's a provocative essay. I think it's a wonderful example of a compare and contrast essay. And it's also a great example of, again, if you want to better understand how any piece of writing asks particular sorts of questions, and by asking those questions also has a particular set of values, I think this is a great essay to get you to see what that can look like. Now, before I finish today, I mentioned I wanted to talk about transitional phrases, because I think what you see in Chua's essay, language that at times she often repeats, but it really helps to tether together, in particular, a compare and contrast essay. Notice, for example, if we just look, I'm picking a paragraph just randomly. Let's go to the first page and pick the third paragraph, the one that begins with all the same. All the same. Even Western parents think they're being strict. All the same, even when Western parents think they're being strict, they usually don't come close to being Chinese mothers. For example, my Western friends who consider themselves strict make their children practice their instruments 30 minutes every day, an hour at most. For a Chinese mother, the first hour is the easy part. It's hours 2 and 3 that get tough. And I would encourage you to, in particular, look for language at the beginning of the sentence, or at the beginning of a sentence, that's offset by a comma. And in this paragraph, you'll see a couple of different phrases, or what are called dependent clauses. All the same, comma, and for example, comma. Those are two wonderful examples of these kinds of transitional phrases, or this kind of transitional language that really helps move the essay forward. You'll also see, because this is a compare and contrast essay, language like by comparison or by contrast, and it's offset by a comma. Often these sorts of transitional phrases or transitional words, they're really just conjunctions, words like and, but, however, but sometimes they're a little more complex, like all the same, for example. And what I would encourage you to do is just take a moment and skim through this essay and look for the sort of language that you think, considering my description, constitutes a transitional phrase or a transitional word. Again, language that you think just helps move the essay forward. Because as you're editing this essay, if you feel like perhaps your essay is a bit stagnant in some places, inserting and including these kinds of transitional words and phrases can really help to spruce up a paragraph or spruce up an essay. Again, it can help the essay move in a way that's a little more readable for your audience. And it also just helps to maintain a kind of momentum, because one of the things I like about this essay, just as a piece of writing, is just how much momentum it has. It doesn't really seem to lag or lull in any places. And again, I think that was deliberate. You almost get the sense that Chua, as a writer, again, she's embodying that Chinese mother stereotype, just unrelenting. She just keeps pushing and pushing, and you can almost feel that in the tone and cadence of the piece itself. Okay, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Continue working on your compare and contrast essays. Please remember about the rough draft folder. So again, contact me if you have any questions. But for now, this is Colin Cox, and I hope all of you have a lovely day.
Hey everyone, Colin one more time, because I realized as I was reviewing this audio that I forgot to say something about the counter-argumentative strategy, and I simply couldn't find a good place to insert this. So as awkward as it seems, I decided to just add it to the end. So on the prompt for the compare and contrast essay, you'll notice there is this language at the end about how I want you to utilize this counter-argumentative strategy at least once in your essay. And what I want to do now is just describe what that means, the benefits of incorporating a counter-argument, and then an example of how you could do this, what this might look like. So basically, your counter-argumentative strategy is when you introduce a possible counter-argument to your thesis. You describe or expound upon that counter-argument, but, and this is the important part, you then complicate that counter-argument. One of the reasons why this is such a beneficial strategy is because it is certainly a different way of developing an argument. Instead of offering supportive claims for your thesis, you offer a potential counter to your thesis and you complicate or argue against it, which I believe has the effect of, at the very least, suggesting that you, as the person writing your essay, as the person who is making or attempting to support a particular thesis, in addition to thinking about claims you could make to support your thesis, you have also thought about and considered possible counter-argumentative claims. So I think if we're just imagining how this might have a positive effect for your reader, and that is to say the way they might think about you, I think this communicates that you have thought carefully and deeply about your argument, about your topic or subject, and again, at the very least, it strengthens what we might call your ethos, which is to say your character. Your reader might be more inclined to trust you because, again, in addition to making all of these affirmative claims about your thesis, you have also taken the time to address possible counter-arguments and counter-claims. So a practical example of what this might look like, if you think back to the prompt and the example that I use on the prompt, let us say I wanted to write an essay about running shoes. So again, we'll use Nike and Puma here. Let us imagine that I want to argue that Nike running shoes are better than Puma for a variety of different reasons. If I were to incorporate a counter-argumentative section or offer a counter-argumentative claim, it might sound, at least the beginning of that paragraph or section, might sound something like this. While I've made several affirmative claims about Nike running shoes, Puma running shoes certainly have their benefits, or Puma running shoes certainly have merit. Let us imagine that one of the points that I want to make is Puma running shoes are more cost effective. Again, I do not know if this is true. This is just a hypothetical. So I would then take a moment and describe what it might mean for Puma running shoes to be more cost effective. Perhaps on average, the Puma running shoe or a Puma running shoe might cost $30, $40, $50 less than an equivalent Nike running shoe. Now, again, as I said a moment ago, to effectively utilize a counter-argumentative strategy, you cannot simply stop there, because a reader might read this and think, well, now I'm confused. Is this an essay that argues that Nike running shoes are preferable, or is this an essay that has now, it seems, changed its position and it actually believes that Puma running shoes are preferable? What you would need to do, or the thing to do at the end of that paragraph or section, is then complicate that point. So I may, for example, say something like, while cost is certainly a consideration for anyone interested in purchasing running shoes, here's the reason why you should not consider, or here's the reason why cost should not and cannot and does not negate my thesis. And you would then do the work of offering that argument or developing that claim. Again, this counter-argumentative strategy is something that I want to see you do at some point in your essay. Customarily, students like to save that counter-argumentative paragraph or section until the end. So if you have a series of body paragraphs and you're then building toward your conclusion, your counter-argumentative paragraph or section may be that paragraph directly before the conclusion. So it might be the penultimate paragraph or section. So if you have any questions about what it means to utilize this counter-argumentative strategy, as always, do not hesitate to email me or contact me. But when I say on the prompt that I want to see you utilize a counter-argumentative strategy, that is exactly what I have in mind. So I hope that helps. Again, for the second time, this is Colin Cox with Northeast State Community College. Have a nice day, and I hope to talk to you soon.